Hello everyone, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to Live It Up, the show where we explore and discuss how to take your life to that next level and beyond. We cover health, wealth, relationships, and how to create a life you absolutely love. I'm your host and coach, Fletcher Ellingson. Amy will be joining us later as we talk about a subject we've never talked about on this show before. Today we're talking about tuberculosis. What is it? How do you prevent it? And who's at risk today? And what do you do if you're exposed to it? It's an interesting conversation, so stick around. We're going to get to all of that soon. Remember, health is the first wealth, so stay with us. But before we get to that, I want to remind you that if you have questions that you would like us to answer on or off the air, you can email them directly to me at fletcher@fletcherellingson.com. And if you're feeling stuck in any area of your life, whether it's financially or your health or in your relationships, get in action. Reach out to us because you don't need to suffer. There are answers and solutions and ways to get unstuck and move forward powerfully. All right, so let's get to the email for today. It says, "Dear Fletcher, the last 6 to 8 months I've been in a funk. From the outside looking in, I'm sure it looks like everything is fine. And I guess it is fine, but I want more, and I don't know what it is exactly. My marriage is fine, my job is okay, I have friends, but something is off. I have interests and I pursue them, but shortly after starting them, I just give up. I lose motivation or it seems like it's too challenging. For instance, I want to learn Spanish, and I'll study for a week or so, and then I just stop. Or I'll start exercising, but it doesn't last. I'm 38 years old and I feel like I should be further along in my life than I am. I'd love to hear some ideas. Thanks, Chase." All right, Chase, first of all, thanks for reaching out. Reaching out for advice or help is a sign of strength, and that means you are strong. So I want you to take note of that. And I want you also to know that there are a lot of people who feel the way you do. They feel like they should be further along in their finances or their health, or their fitness, or their career. They feel like they should have a better marriage or closer or more friendships. And as I reflected on your words, it reminded me of a quote I recently read that says, "What we want to master, we must be willing to be poor at initially." All right, commitment must transcend our fear of being incompetent. I'm going to say that again. What we want to master, we must be willing to be poor at initially. Commitment must transcend our fear of being incompetent. Many people start a new hobby or job or begin learning a new language or sport, and at first it's really fun. And why is it so fun? Well, it's because it's new and it's actually fun and stimulating to learn new things. Your brain is making all sorts of connections and you're learning new information and applying it, and you're seeing all sorts of progress, and that feels good. And that's part of the key thing. When we make progress, we feel good. You see, one of the things that humans want more than anything else is to feel good. And when we make progress, that's how we feel, good. Consider it. Have you ever built something from scratch? I mean, you got out lumber and got out the tools and built something. Maybe it was a dog house, maybe it was an actual house, or who knows what it is. Or maybe you fixed something around the house and that you've never fixed before. Or maybe you cook or bake something that you've never created before. The newness and feeling of accomplishment feels good. We love to experience a sense of progress. Now, usually when we're learning a new skill, we see lots of progress in the beginning because it's new to us. And let's say you're learning tennis, for instance. In the beginning, it's a challenge just to get it over the net consistently. And when you do, it feels good. But as you try to refine your ability to really place the ball strategically on the other side, it quickly becomes apparent that it takes way more skill and practice than just getting it over the net. We don't see that fast progress anymore because what we're doing is requiring way more skill. So what happens at this point is we may become frustrated at the lack of progress. And because there's not much progress happening, we don't get that good feeling. And so many people at this point give up, or they may say something like, "Oh, I lost interest in tennis," or "It wasn't for me." Often what they really mean is that they stopped because they were not seeing enough progress, and it ceased being fun or feeling good. I hope that makes sense. Now, there's nothing wrong with this, but it's important to realize that this can become a habit. It can become a habit to start projects or new jobs or new relationships even, because in the beginning, we see lots of progress and it feels good. But then we reach a point where we stop progressing, where there's less progress and it becomes more challenging. It's at this point where we need to remind ourselves that what we want to master, we must be willing to be poor at initially. This is universal. You have to be willing to be poor at things initially, okay? Commitment must transcend our fear of being incompetent. None of us want to be incompetent, but we have to understand that in that early stage of progress, there's going to be times of challenge. It always has to happen before we become proficient or masterful. Mastery takes a lot of time, a high level of commitment, and a lot of, ready for it? Self-compassion. But just as progress feels really good, so does being proficient at a particular skill, whether it's a language, your hobby, a job, how you interact in relationships. Becoming proficient and competent feels good. So my advice to you is to simply stay the course. When it gets too challenging, know that you're about to learn something about yourself, that you are about ready to grow, that you're about ready to have a breakthrough. Find someone who has done what you want to do and model them. Get an accountability buddy, read about it, watch a video about it, come at it from a different angle, but stay the course because you're likely close to reaching that next level. Be patient and stay in action. Chase, I believe in you. All right, we're going to take a quick break and we're going to be right back with Amy. Hey everybody, welcome back to Live It Up. We are here with Amy. Hello, Amy.
Hello.
Good to see you. Good to have you here as always.
Thank you.
Hey, what are we talking about today?
We're going to talk about TB.
TB. Is that the same thing as tuberculosis?
It is.
Okay.
Yeah, so they're the same thing. So TB is just short for tuberculosis, and it's caused by something called Mycobacterium tuberculosis, which is a type of bacteria. Mm-hmm. Yep, it's an infectious disease that affects the lungs primarily, but can infect and affect other parts of the body.
I think most people have heard of this disease, and you were telling me earlier that it's really quite an old disease, yeah? Can you share some of the history about it?
Yeah, I mean, like if you think about something like Ebola, we've heard about that more recently. And like tuberculosis is something that is very, very old. I mean, it's ancient, really. They say that it can be tracked back about 9,000 years in humans, where they found some tuberculosis in the remains of a mother and child that were buried together in an island and land that's now underneath water off of the coast of Israel. And then the earliest writings about TB occurred in India about 3,300 years ago. So
wow. It's
been around a really long time. And throughout like the 16 to 1800s in Europe, it was responsible for about 25% of all deaths. I mean, it was really, really common. In the 1700s, it was called the White Plague because people got very pale when they were sick. And then probably a lot of people have heard about consumption, or if you've ever read any old books from the 1800s, they talk about consumption, and that's TB. So consumption is TB. And that was, it looked like the patient or the person was being consumed because they got very, very thin. And so it was called that. There was a name in the Middle Ages. TB was often called, or the kind of TB, it can cause these really big lymph nodes in your neck, and that was called scrofula.
Scrofula?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and so just one other bit of history. So in 1882, the doctor announced the discovery of the actual bacteria, and that prior to that, people...
Wait, when did you say that was?
1882.
Okay.
So prior to that, the germ theory was new. I mean, so people didn't even really understand that diseases were caused by germs. And so before that they knew that, there was a lot of superstition about TB, and whole families would be dying, and they wouldn't know what was going on. So I was doing some reading, and they actually thought in some places that vampires were involved, and that somehow after a family member had died, there were some places in the world and in the U.S. where they would actually dig up bodies that have been buried so they could burn like their heart and liver or something, or at least their heart, so they wouldn't be able to be active as a vampire. But obviously, once they knew it was an infectious disease, then that changed.
I hope.
Yeah. Right.
So is TB found in any other species besides humans?
Yeah, that's interesting. It was like one of the first questions you asked me the other night when we were talking about this. Yeah, so it can be found in animals, many animals in the United States, including cattle and deer. And archaeologists have found TB in ancient bison in Wyoming dating back to over 17,000 years ago.
Wow.
And so in our country, about 1 million cattle are tested each year for TB. Cattle can get TB usually from wildlife like deer, and it is possible for animals to infect humans, but it's very uncommon.
And I'm assuming that if a deer or cattle get infected with it, they can die from it, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Can they be just carriers of it and not be consumed?
Yeah, and so same thing, and I'll get to this in just a minute in my talk, that you can have latent TB, which means you've just been exposed, or active TB, and only when you have active TB can you spread it.
Got it, okay.
Yeah.
Next question, how common is it? Because we definitely hear about it like when we're watching period pieces,
Yeah.
and I thought it was like maybe a disease of olden days, but how common is it today?
Yeah, so worldwide, especially, TB is a really big problem. It's one of the top 10 causes of death in the world. And in 2017, 10 million people were infected with TB or were diagnosed, and about 1.5 million died. The last data, like official data in the U.S., was from 2016, and there were 9,200 reported cases in the U.S., so not that many in the U.S. And about 1 million children worldwide are infected with TB right now. One of the things that made TB make a little bit of a comeback, unfortunately, was HIV/AIDS, because TB tends to become more active and be more of a problem when your immune system is suppressed. So the good news on the incidence is that the rate of TB is falling by 2% every year. And so lots of lives are saved with diagnosis and treatment. And actually the World Health Organization has a goal of eradicating TB from the world by 2030.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's in 10 years.
I know, yeah.
Wow, there's going to be in action then.
Yeah.
Have you ever treated or diagnosed somebody with TB?
Yeah, in Lesotho, where I work in Southern Africa, I have, for sure. Here in the U.S., I don't think I've ever seen an actual active case of it. I've seen people who had been infected, had been in sanatoriums, which I'll talk about, but in Lesotho is the only place I've actually seen it be active.
Got it, okay.
Yeah.
So what symptoms would a person have if they have it?
Yeah, so if they have active TB, there's pretty obvious symptoms where there's a bad cough, like a persistent cough for weeks or months, night sweats, weight loss. People can be coughing up blood. So again, it's way more common in areas where there's malnutrition and where there's more HIV/AIDS, like for example in Lesotho.
Okay. And if someone's coughing up blood, I'm assuming that that's advanced, right?
Well, I mean, it's TB in their lungs, and hopefully if someone's coughing up blood, they go to the doctor.
Yeah. Okay. So what are the ways to test for it?
Yeah, so this is where it's a little complicated, where there's something called latent TB, which means that a person has been exposed to TB, but if they're in good health, their body just kind of contains that bacteria and nothing else happens. And so the way you test for...
I have a question about that. When someone's been exposed to that, what does that mean, like, I've been exposed to it? Like, you've been in the same room with a person?
Right, you've been in close contact enough where someone was coughing and you inhaled that.
Okay.
Right, so I think I shared with you, I test positive for it, and I think I got it from working with some recent migrants from South America when I was in high school back in Los Angeles. And so I was we were in their home, we were bringing food, it was more of a close contact situation. And they would have had to have active TB to be able to spread it.
Got it.
Yeah. So for latent TB, you do a skin test. So anyone who's worked at a healthcare environment, sometimes schools do it, you do this little skin test that was created back in the 1920s 20s and 30s. It's a little tiny needle. They put a little bit of this protein underneath your skin that's been taken from TB, and if you develop a swelling, you get measured 48 to 72 hours later. If you have a big swelling, depending on the size, it's considered positive. We also have a blood test these days, and that's to know if someone has been exposed, because there is treatment for that. So like when I was found out I was exposed, I was in college, and then I took like 9 months of antibiotics to try to prevent it from, it reduces your risk of ever having it become active later. So because the other caveat is if someone has active TB, the way we diagnose that is with an x-ray and actually looking at the phlegm that they cough up. We can test for it that way. And the person has to be isolated if that's the case, obviously.
So somebody with a latent TB, they can develop that later on in their life? Yeah,
there's a risk, especially if their immune system was compromised, like if they had to have chemotherapy or something like that.
So that bacteria is just in their body ongoingly?
Just like, well, it's contained, it's not active, so it's just there someplace.
And I know you may not have the answer to this, but I'm going to ask anyways. When you say it's contained, like, where is it contained?
Well, a lot of people that have been exposed to TB on their x-ray will have a very small area of scar. And so it can be even in the lung where it's just like this little cavitary area where it's there. I don't actually know exactly because TB can show up in the bones and the organs, and so I'm not sure. I don't know like the reservoir for it, but people can have it in their lung.
And the antibiotics have just kind of stalled it out.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Kind of. Okay, we're gonna take a quick commercial break.
All right, we'll be back. Stay with us. Hey everybody, welcome back to Live It Up. We're talking with Amy, and today we're talking about tuberculosis, learning some really interesting things about it. My next question is, once you've been exposed to the TB, how long before you start feeling sick?
Well, yeah, for most people, like I said, once they've been exposed, if they're young and healthy, they won't get sick. Maybe ever. Like, again, I didn't know that I was exposed.
You mean just because your immune system kind of takes care of it?
Yeah, and so it's just only if like you again have HIV/AIDS or you're malnourished or something, then you would get sick. So I know we were just kind of kidding that you didn't know that about me. Like somehow I'm contagious, which I'm not.
Yeah.
Even though I've been exposed to it.
Got it. Okay. So some countries actually have a vaccine against this. So tell me about that. Yeah,
it's called the BCG vaccine. It was developed in the 1920s. And the United States has never been a country where we've done it routinely. And what I've been told the reason that is because, first of all, TB is not that common in the U.S. Also, the vaccine doesn't necessarily help prevent that well against the lung form of TB. What it is about 70 to 80% effective in preventing meningitis from TB, which is mostly happens in children. So in most of South America, it's given. A lot of other countries, it's routinely given. I was looking up, like in the United Kingdom, it's given only in people who live in certain areas where TB is more common, where a child might be exposed. So it's never been given in the U.S., like I said, because it's a lower risk of getting it here, and it doesn't necessarily prevent us from getting pulmonary TB.
Gotcha, okay.
But lots of other countries do, and then if you've been vaccinated, you cannot be skin tested because you'll react as if you have been exposed to TB.
Got it, okay. So let's say somebody does have it, how are they treated?
Yeah, so if you actually have active TB, you get antibiotics. So that was a major breakthrough in treating tuberculosis in the 1940s. The first antibiotic came out that started treating it, and then in the 1950s and 60s, there's 4 main drugs that came out, and we still use those 4 main drugs for TB now. I was reading some interesting kind of cures. They used to think that, especially if you had it of the neck, that scrofula, if you went and saw the king or queen and they touched you, it would help. And then before antibiotics, in the 1800s, they started sending people to sanatoriums. And a lot of people in our state, like say you're in your 70s or 80s, you may remember that. I mean, our state had multiple sanatoriums. I think the closest one was in Yakima. And we're basically taking people out of the home, having them go someplace where there's fresh air, where they can leave, doors and windows open. And a lot of people, just because they were healthy enough, they just could recover. But people would be there for 9 months, 10 months, a year, 2 years, and young adults, they were sent away to sanatoriums. So before we did antibiotics, that was the main treatment. Actually, in 1953, I was reading that the U.S. had 839 sanatoriums
Whoa.
servicing about 140,000 people.
Wow.
In the U.S., yeah. If you talk to people in their 80s, they usually know people who either went to sanatorium, they may have gone themselves.
Interesting.
Yeah.
You were mentioning earlier on our car ride down here that there are a lot of people in literature who died of TB or who had it.
Yeah, or who wrote about it.
Yeah, who wrote about it.
And they actually used to think they sometimes even call it like the artist disease, because I don't know if it's because a lot of them maybe were malnourished because they were starving artists, or
Right.
maybe they had, I don't know why. But I found a list of people who actually either were sick or died from TB, and a list of people who died from TB are just a short list would be John Keats, Edgar Allan Poe, Chopin, Emily Bronte, Eleanor Roosevelt, Robert Louis Stevenson, and George Orwell. And then if you're someone who has ever read any Russian literature, which I love, Crime and Punishment, TB was a big part of that book. Also in the storyline of Les Miserables, there was TB, and also in La Bohème, which is a book that then they based the movie and play Rent after. But in Rent, they used HIV/AIDS, but in the story, it was based on La Bohème. It was tuberculosis, yeah.
Interesting. Wow. Thanks for all that information. Is there anything else we should know or you want to add at this point?
Yeah, well, I think that, luckily enough in the United States, we don't have much of a risk. But if the risk that you mainly would have is, say, you travel to a country where they do have TB, or especially if you can find that out like on the CDC website. There also are some newer strains of tuberculosis that are drug resistant. So it is important to know where those places in the world are that might be more at risk. But I think it's hopeful that there's a lot of groups that are working to end TB, and the fact that there's been a decrease in the incidence every year. But it is a real thing, and it is something to look out for. And obviously, if you ever had symptoms like night sweats, coughing up blood, and weight loss, I would really hope you'd go see someone right away.
All right, good.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Amy. All right, that's it for today. It is now time for you to get out there, be a source of kindness, be a source of contribution. You have something that this world needs, and we believe in you.